Was this meant to be the night Ukraine finally broke, or the night Russia miscalculated beyond repair? As December approached its midpoint, while diplomats floated ceasefire language and television panels debated off-ramps, the war moved in the opposite direction, accelerating toward a far more dangerous phase. The Kremlin believed pressure, not compromise, would decide the outcome. The strategy was blunt: overwhelm Ukraine's energy grid, drain civilian morale, and force Kyiv to the table, weakened, isolated, and desperate. But did Moscow underestimate how much leverage Ukraine still possessed? That question hangs over everything that followed. In the days leading up to the strikes, Russia intensified one of the largest aerial bombardment campaigns of the war. More than 1,600 loitering munitions, hundreds of UAVs, and dozens of cruise and ballistic missiles launched in coordinated waves. Power stations, substations, and urban infrastructure were not collateral damage. They were the objective. The Kremlin's calculation was clear. Darkness equals pressure, cold equals leverage, and leverage, Moscow believed, would translate into concessions territory, neutrality, and silence. Behind the scenes, the diplomatic clock was also ticking. With Donald Trump back in the White House, Washington's tone had shifted. The administration framed peace as a transaction, not a moral crusade. According to multiple Western briefings, U.S. officials signaled that negotiations would require painful compromises, implicitly referencing Donbas and Russian-occupied territories. That messaging, amplified by global media, fed directly into Moscow's narrative. Ukraine was running out of time, ammunition, and friends. From the Kremlin's perspective, this was the moment to squeeze. Yet pressure cuts both ways. Ukrainian leadership understood that surrendering under fire would not end the war, it would redefine it. President Volodymyr Zelensky's inner circle reportedly warned that accepting talks under blackout conditions would project weakness not only to Moscow, but to NATO capitals watching closely. The question for Kyiv was existential: endure the punishment quietly or flip the board entirely. This was not just a battlefield decision, it was an economic one. Russia's war effort depends on energy revenues, industrial continuity, and the perception of domestic stability. Ukraine's survival depends on Western confidence and internal resilience. In that equation, timing mattered as much as firepower. Any response had to be fast, undeniable, and psychologically disruptive, something that would shatter assumptions in Moscow, Washington, and European capitals simultaneously. What followed would not resemble a traditional counterstrike. It would be a statement crafted to demonstrate reach, coordination, and intent. Ukrainian planners had watched Russia rely on the idea that the homeland was untouchable, protected by layered air defenses and distance. That assumption, they believed, was the real vulnerability. If it cracked, everything else would follow. As night fell over northern Russia, air raid sirens were not expected to sound. Airports were not supposed to close. And Moscow, the nerve center of political power and economic confidence, was never meant to feel the war directly. But within hours, that illusion would collapse, triggering a chain reaction far beyond the blast radius of any single drone. And if the capital itself could be paralyzed, what did that mean for the rest of Russia? How does a capital of more than 20 million people react when the war it watches on television suddenly arrives overhead? In the early hours of December 11th, that question answered itself in real time. Ukrainian drones did not arrive as a single wave or a symbolic gesture. They came in coordinated swarms, probing, diverting, and overwhelming Russian air defenses across an enormous geographic arc. Northern Russia, long treated as a strategic rear, became an active battlefield in a matter of minutes. Moscow was not the only target, but it was the message. As air defense units engaged across multiple districts, fragments rained down on suburbs like Odintsovo and Ramenskoye. Explosions echoed far enough to be heard inside airport terminals. Passengers waiting on tarmacs felt the shockwaves through aircraft fuselages. Screens flickered, warnings blared. And then, one by one, the airports closed. Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo. The city's air gateways went dark, severing Moscow's physical connection to the outside world. What followed was not panic in the cinematic sense, it was paralysis. Thousands of travelers were trapped inside terminals, sitting on floors using coats as blankets, instructed to stay away from windows. More than 400 flights across Russia were cancelled. Over 170 departures and arrivals in Moscow alone were marked in red. For up to 7 hours, Russian airspace around the capital effectively ceased to function. This was not a delay caused by weather or technical failure. It was a shutdown caused by war. Russian aviation authorities later confirmed that restrictions spread beyond Moscow to strategic regional hubs, including Grozny and Makhachkala. Even diplomatic immunity dissolved under the pressure. The Armenian Prime Minister's aircraft reportedly circled for an extended period, unable to land safely. These details mattered. They revealed that the disruption was not localized, it was systemic. A state that prides itself on control suddenly had none. Every intercepted drone still achieved its purpose. Even debris falling from the sky forced closures, emergency responses, and fear. This is the overlooked reality of modern drone warfare. Interception does not equal prevention. The cost of defending every square kilometer of airspace every minute of the night is economically and psychologically exhausting. Western analysts have repeatedly warned that layered air defense systems, while effective against missiles, struggle against mass low-cost UAV saturation. Moscow experienced that vulnerability firsthand. For ordinary Russians, the symbolism cut deeper than the explosions. Airports are places of order, schedules, and predictability, pillars of normal life. Seeing them transformed into makeshift shelters shattered the narrative that the war was distant and controlled. Social media filled with amateur footage despite censorship risks. The message was unmistakable: the sky was no longer safe. Strategically, this moment reverberated far beyond Russia. NATO planners watched closely. If Ukraine could penetrate air defenses around one of the most heavily protected capitals on Earth, the assumptions governing deterrence and escalation were being rewritten. For Moscow, the question became urgent and uncomfortable. If defenses failed here, where else were they failing? And as dawn approached, another realization set in: this was only the opening act. If the paralysis of Moscow was the psychological shock, the next phase delivered the strategic wound. As Russian authorities scrambled to restore order around the capital, Ukrainian strikes were already unfolding far beyond the ring roads and airport perimeters. This was not a campaign aimed at headlines alone. It was an operation designed to strike the industrial bloodstream that keeps Russia's war machine alive. And for the first time in months, that bloodstream was visibly exposed. The first confirmed impacts hit deep in Russia's industrial heartland. In Veliki Novgorod, explosions ripped through the PAO Akron chemical complex, a facility long described in open-source intelligence reports as dual-use. Officially a fertilizer producer, the plant also supplies chemical precursors essential for explosives and propellants used in artillery and missile production. Witnesses reported multiple detonations shortly after midnight. Flames lit the skyline. Emergency crews struggled to contain fires spreading through interconnected production units. Even temporary disruption here carried outsized consequences. Almost simultaneously, strikes reached the Smolensk region. The Dorogobuj nitrogen fertilizer plant and its associated thermal power infrastructure were hit in rapid succession. These facilities are part of Russia's ammonium nitrate supply chain, an unglamorous but critical component of mass artillery warfare. Western defense analysts have repeatedly noted that Russia's ability to sustain high shell consumption depends less on launchers than on chemical throughput. Interrupt that flow and the front lines feel it weeks later. This is where the economic dimension becomes unavoidable. Russia's war economy is not infinitely resilient. According to assessments cited by Reuters and Defense News, Russia has already been operating key industrial sites at near maximum capacity since mid-year, compensating for sanctions through volume rather than efficiency. Facilities like Akron and Dorogobuj function as choke points. They cannot be easily replaced, relocated, or repaired under fire. Every day offline compounds downstream shortages from shells to fuel additives. The strikes also exposed a strategic dilemma for Moscow's air defense doctrine. Protecting industrial targets hundreds of kilometers from the front requires redeploying systems already stretched thin. Move them inward and frontline units in Donbass and Crimea face greater missile vulnerability. Keep them forward and factories, refineries, and power plants remain exposed. Western military experts describe this as a classic opportunity cost trap. Defending one asset inherently weakens another. For Ukraine, this was deliberate. The operation was not about total destruction. It was about forcing choices. Each drone, each strike compelled Russia to spend more defending its rear than attacking Ukraine's front. NATO officials speaking anonymously to European outlets acknowledged that this kind of pressure aligns with long-standing alliance assessments. Modern wars are won by degrading logistics and morale, not by capturing ground alone. By the time Russian authorities issued elevated alerts for regions like Lipetsk, the pattern was unmistakable. The attack was layered, synchronized, and geographically expansive. It signaled that no industrial node within reach could assume immunity. And as reports of disruptions filtered through state-controlled media, the Kremlin faced a growing problem, not just damage, but visibility. Because when factories burn and production stalls, even censorship struggles to contain the truth. And the deeper winter crept into Russia's cities, the consequences of those strikes were only beginning to surface. What happens to a modern city when electricity fails in the dead of winter, and how quickly does inconvenience turn into crisis? For Russia, this was no longer a theoretical question. As Ukrainian strikes rippled through power generation and transmission networks, the consequences extended far beyond darkness. In cities across western and northern Russia, outages became a multiplier, transforming military pressure into civilian vulnerability almost overnight. Russia's urban infrastructure is uniquely exposed to this kind of disruption. Central heating systems, the backbone of winter survival for millions, rely on electrically powered pumps to circulate hot water through vast networks of pipes. When power cuts hit, those pumps stop. At temperatures hovering between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius, stagnant water freezes rapidly. Pipes burst from the inside. Once that happens, restoring electricity does not restore heat. Buildings can remain uninhabitable for months. In places like Voronezh, Novgorod, and parts of the Moscow region, this cascading failure posed an existential risk to daily life. High-rise apartment blocks home to much of Russia's urban population became vertical traps. Elevators stopped. Water pressure dropped. Sanitation systems faltered. Within days, hygiene risks increased sharply. Western public health experts have long warned that winter blackouts in dense cities can trigger secondary crises: respiratory illness, frozen plumbing, and emergency hospital overload. Hospitals themselves were not immune. Backup generators can sustain intensive care units only as long as fuel supplies last. Dialysis machines, neonatal units, and ventilators depend on uninterrupted power. Russian emergency services insisted systems were under control, but the deployment of chemical and radiological monitoring teams to fire sites in St. Petersburg suggested a deeper concern. These were not routine outages. They were treated as potential compound emergencies. Communications suffered next. Internet routers went dark. Cellular base stations running on limited backup power fell silent within hours. ATMs stopped functioning. Digital payments froze. Russia's heavily promoted cashless economy abruptly reverted to cues, uncertainty, and rumor. When official broadcasts lag or disappear, state authority erodes quickly. Analysts at the Atlantic Council have repeatedly noted that authoritarian systems depend disproportionately on information dominance. When that dominance fractures, fear fills the gap. This is where the strikes crossed a critical threshold. They no longer targeted military assets alone. They challenged the social fabric that underpins political control. Russians began asking questions that state media could not easily answer. If Moscow's airports could shut down for hours, if regional power grids could falter, how safe was any city? How secure was the promise of normal life? NATO observers understood the implication immediately. This was not indiscriminate punishment. It was strategic pressure calibrated to expose systemic fragility. Winter, once Russia's ally in war, was becoming a liability at home. And with every frozen pipe and silent streetlight, the cost of continuing the conflict rose not just in rubles, but in public confidence. As these effects spread, another audience was paying close attention across the Atlantic, because the timing of this escalation carried a message far beyond Russia's borders. And that message was about leverage. Was this escalation aimed only at Moscow, or was it also calibrated for Washington? As the scale of the strikes became clear, attention shifted westward across the Atlantic. The timing was impossible to ignore. In the days before the attacks, diplomatic signals from the United States had grown sharper. President Donald Trump's administration framed peace as a transaction governed by leverage, repeatedly emphasizing that Ukraine would need to make concessions to end the war. Leaks reported by major Western outlets suggested that withdrawal from parts of Donbas was quietly being floated as a starting point. For Kyiv, this was not diplomacy, it was pressure. From Moscow's perspective, that pressure looked like opportunity. Russian state media amplified the narrative that even Washington accepted Ukraine's weakening position. The Kremlin interpreted Trump's rhetoric through the lens it understands: best bargaining power belongs to whoever can impose costs. That belief drove Russia's intensified bombardment of Ukrainian infrastructure designed to demonstrate inevitability. But Zelensky's response was crafted to rupture that perception in one decisive stroke. The strikes of December 11th were not random acts of retaliation. They were a strategic communication delivered through force. By paralyzing Moscow, disrupting energy production, and exposing industrial vulnerabilities, Ukraine sent a message to every negotiating table simultaneously. To Washington, Kyiv was not negotiating from collapse. To Europe, escalation did not automatically favor Moscow, and to Russia, the homeland was now part of the battlefield. Western military analysts described the move as a calculated challenge. Ukraine demonstrated the ability to reach deep into Russia using a combination of long-range drones and domestically developed missile systems such as modified Neptune platforms and emerging strike capabilities reportedly tested earlier this year. Defense experts quoted in British and American media emphasized that the significance was not the individual weapons, but the coordination low-cost systems forcing high-cost defenses into constant reaction. For NATO, the implications were sobering. The alliance has long assessed that future conflicts would hinge on industrial endurance and homeland resilience. Ukraine's operation validated those models in real time. By forcing Russia to divert air defense assets away from the front or accept continued damage at home, Kyiv altered the strategic geometry of the war. This is the essence of modern deterrence, not overwhelming force but unsustainable pressure. Economically, the signal was equally sharp. Ukraine's concurrent strike on a tanker linked to Russia's so-called shadow fleet in the Black Sea underlined that energy revenues were now a legitimate pressure point. Western sanctions have constrained Russian exports, but enforcement gaps remain. Disrupting logistics at sea and production on land multiplies that impact. Analysts at leading European think tanks warned that sustained attacks on these nodes could accelerate inflation, budget strain, and domestic discontent inside Russia. For Trump's administration, the dilemma sharpened. Pushing Kyiv too hard risked emboldening Moscow. Supporting Ukraine more openly risked escalation. Zelensky's message was unmistakable: peace imposed under duress would not hold. Leverage still existed and it could be exercised. As diplomats recalibrated their language, one reality became unavoidable. The war was no longer confined to trenches and front lines. It had entered a phase where political narratives, economic endurance, and public confidence mattered as much as territory. And inside Russia, the consequences of that shift were becoming impossible to hide. What happens when a political system built on stability can no longer guarantee it? That question now sits at the center of Russia's internal crisis. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin's implicit social contract with the Russian population was simple political obedience in exchange for security, predictability, and a rising standard of living. Wars could be fought abroad, sanctions could be managed, and hardships could be explained so long as daily life inside Russia remained orderly. The events of mid-December tore that contract apart. The images told the story more powerfully than any opposition speech ever could. Travelers sleeping on airport floors in Moscow, residents filming explosions near industrial zones in Novgorod, apartment blocks facing freezing temperatures as power and heating systems faltered. These were not abstract geopolitical consequences. They were lived experiences shared quietly through encrypted channels and amateur videos before censors could react. When the capital itself appears vulnerable, fear travels faster than propaganda. From the Kremlin's fortified offices, the official message remained defiant. Putin, meeting with senior generals, insisted that operations were proceeding according to plan. Negotiations, he implied, would not change Russia's objectives. But outside those walls, the disconnect was obvious. If the plan was working, why were airports closed for hours? Why were chemical plants burning hundreds of kilometers from the front? Why were emergency services stretched thin in multiple regions simultaneously? Western analysts increasingly describe this moment as an inflection point rather than a turning point. Russia has not collapsed. Its military has not withdrawn. But something more subtle and potentially more dangerous for the Kremlin has occurred. The myth of invulnerability has cracked. Once broken, it is difficult to restore. NATO intelligence assessments have long argued that authoritarian systems are most brittle when they lose the ability to convincingly project control. December's events accelerated that process. The strategic dilemma for Moscow is now acute. Reinforce air defenses around major cities and industrial hubs, and frontline forces in Donbas and Crimea face greater exposure to Ukrainian missiles and drones. Maintain focus on the front, and the home front absorbs continued disruption. Either choice carries escalating costs. This is precisely the trap Ukrainian planners intended to set. For Ukraine, the objective was never to terrorize civilians. It was to force recognition internally within Russia and externally among Western partners that the war cannot be compartmentalized. It will not remain neatly contained beyond Russia's borders or beneath its propaganda. The battlefield has expanded into economic psychology and legitimacy. As winter deepens, that pressure will only intensify. Energy infrastructure, logistics networks, and public morale will become decisive variables. And for the first time since the invasion began, many Russians are confronting a reality their leadership promised would never arrive. The war is no longer something happening somewhere else. When the lights go out and the cold sets in, slogans lose their power. And once that realization spreads, the Kremlin's greatest challenge may no longer be Ukraine's weapons, but its own people's questions. The events of December marked a profound escalation in the war's logic and geography. Russia's attempt to coerce Ukraine through massive infrastructure strikes aimed at freezing cities and forcing political concessions backfired dramatically. Ukraine's response was not limited to defense or symbolic retaliation. It was a coordinated strategic operation that reached deep into Russia's capital region, paralyzed Moscow's airports, disrupted industrial production, and exposed the fragility of systems long assumed to be secure. These strikes carried layered meaning. Militarily, they forced Russia into an air defense dilemma it cannot easily solve. Economically, they targeted the industrial and energy foundations of Russia's war effort. Politically, they shattered the illusion that the conflict could be contained beyond Russia's borders. And diplomatically, they sent a clear signal to Washington, NATO, and Europe that Ukraine still holds leverage and will not negotiate from a position of fear. Looking ahead, winter will amplify these pressures. Energy shortages, industrial strain, and public anxiety will test Russia's internal resilience, just as Western capitals debate the next phase of support and diplomacy. The question now is no longer whether the war can spread, but how much strain each side can endure. So what do you think? Has this moment permanently changed the balance of pressure in the war? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay informed as this story develops, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.